Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
So, Marcus, a long time ago, an employee of mine told me a really, really insightful quote. He said, "Life is like photography. It's black and white, and it's best experienced with plenty of contrast." And why am I saying this? Because you, my dear friend, are surrounded in cold and wet and rain, and I am sitting in Portugal in sunshine.
Fuck's sakes. That was a long-winded slap in the face.
Oh,
Jesus
yeah, but you're a good
Christ.
friend.
You are so creative, aren't you? Well, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. So you
Yeah,
get
I
your
know.
own taste of all that lovely, lovely English summer.
But enough of our whinging about the weather or bragging about the weather. Who's on the show?
So today we have Peter Thomson on the show and his book 500%. Really great story of a company who managed to turn itself from a normal classic organization into one that was heavily, if not purely, self-managed by the people who work there. And while they're doing that, increasing the value or the profit of the company by 500%, which is pretty astonishing. And so it's a great book. What were your insights?
Yeah, well, he talks about fractals, and I told the story during the show briefly. I was first exposed to fractals and the concept of fractals as a mathematical equation back in 88 and 89 when I was working for Silicon Graphics, with this idea of making groups smaller and smaller and smaller and more autonomous is really, really interesting. What came out of it for me that was insightful is not every employee has the right mindset to be able to do that. You really need to have a high level of entrepreneurial mindset to be able to be that kind of autonomous group or to be that kind of an autonomous individual. But what were your takeaways?
So my takeaway was that well, there's a couple, but what I really liked is just the way the CEOs decided to trust their employees, which might sound like an obvious thing to look at, but in the end, it was actually pretty astounding, and I think it's a very brave thing to do. And it's sort of quite more modern thing to look at. And when they started doing that, they just tested things, and a few things didn't quite work, but in the end, they got to this amazing result. So actually, trusting that your workers are good at their job, they're smart to find new solutions, and they can amazingly perform is a really nice angle that unfortunately we don't find that often, because we put managers in place that we oddly trust instead, and then manage the hell out of people and make them miserable and make them underperform, and sort of are surprised why this is even happening. So yeah, I think it's that trusting aspect. Even so, there's a little tidbit to know, because I was talking to Lisa Gill, who's also quite into teal or self-managed organizations, and she said, because she knows the company as well, and she said one of the CEOs hasn't just studied economics, he also studied psychology. And that probably goes a long way to actually have someone with an angle as a leader to go, look, these are people we're talking to here. We trust those people, we hired those people for the right reasons. So let them do their job properly and let's trust them. So it's trust in your own people.
And with this kind of experience that we're talking to these kinds of people, we're talking to these kinds of companies, we're really witnessing a shift in how consultancy, traditional management consultancy, is having to adapt and having to change to these new ways of working, these new organizational structures.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of my biggest criticism, having worked around the big 4 or 5, whatever, now over 20 years. The business model there is just off. It doesn't seem to apply to modern companies, because what we want and what we see in the book, what we see in some places or startups work really, really well is you have a lean team that's smart, efficient, and effective on top of it, right? And what a lot of consultancies seem to be doing is just bringing tons of people in there, all specialists. Everyone can only do one thing, costs a lot of money, and it's all about headcount. Whereas the opposite is a modern way of working: low headcount, smart, and having mobility built in. So I find that an odd
Yeah.
contradiction to, and I'm not surprised that more and more companies potentially are just getting tired of paying so much money to these consultancies. It's just bringing too many people and costs a lot of money for way less effectiveness than they might claim. And on top of that, people like McKinsey telling us, well, 70% of those projects where you hire big consultancies don't bring the business benefits back. So it's all lost money. And that's the industry in
But
peril.
procurement wants to buy days of people's lives, and the future is paying for real value. But Marcus, where is the value? The value is in us going to.
The interview.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Wicked Podcast. Today, we've got Peter Thomson here with us. We're really great and glad to have you on the show today. We're going to jump right in, Peter. Tell us a little about who you are and why you wrote the book.
Right. I guess I'm most famous for probably writing a book 10 years ago now, which was about the future of work, called Future Work, funnily enough. And that's something I've studied for longer than I dare to think about. After my career in HR, I set up a center at the Henley Business School looking at the future of work and ran that for something like 15 years. And since then, have really been, I guess, a bit ahead of the time to some extent, thinking about the way the world of work is changing. And because what's happened now, COVID has made the world of work change rather rapidly. So I've studied the whole future of work for a number of years. I now run something called the Future Work Forum, which is a group of consultants around the world interested in the subject. And I came across a company called Matt Black Systems, well over a decade ago now, which were doing some interesting things, and we'll talk more about what they are. And contacted the two guys who ran the company. And between us, in the end, we decided it was an interesting enough story that it warranted a book, and hence the book we're about to talk about, 500%, came out as a result of that. But it took probably the best part of 5 years between the three authors to get the thing finally into print, because their company was evolving as we were writing the book, and B, we wanted to get the kind of the story right all the way along. So I was, in a sense, a catalyst with Andrew and Julian, the other authors, to kind of pull their ideas together as the two guys running this company and get it into a book. So that's me.
Well, they say that wicked problems are problems that change in the process of solving them. And it sounds like your book was in the process of changing while you were trying to write it.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there was a history of Matt Black Systems having changed from a conventionally managed company to one which is very much a self-management model. And they were still ironing out the wrinkles at the time we started the book, because it was still early days in having essentially the employees run the organization. And by the time we'd finished, I kind of helped, I think, Andrew and Julian understand more about the kind of management system they set up, sort of by accident in a way. They experimented with different ways of trying to get people to own the work that they did, and in the end ended up effectively with the individual employees running almost, having their own profit and loss statement, running their own bit of the company. But we could maybe talk about how we got to that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an amazing read. I mean, it's one of the books that I by accident came past, to be honest, because I was trying to read more and more up around teal organizations and self-managed organizations, and great find. And it's quite a small book, but there's a lot of detail in there, which is brilliant. So one of the things, by my own experience working in change and transformation, often is that regardless the way you look at it, having self-managed teams seems to rarely be a consideration, changing the governance model, right? In the end, most companies I know still either don't consider it or fall back into those habits of having everything managed by managers. What do you think it was in this particular company that started this even to be considered, and then to be considered to such an extent?
I think it was the two guys that run the company I think are fairly unique in that, unlike most people in a position of power, particularly leaders in large organizations, their motivation is to have a big budget, to have lots of people, to control an empire, uh, and and organize things and be leaders. And these two guys were almost the opposite. They didn't want to be telling people what to do. They wanted to let people get on and do their own thing. And so they ended up with something that's a little more like a franchise where the individuals own their own piece of the company. And I mean, the obvious stage was when Andrew and Julian like left the building because they had an office there. They felt as long as they were there, the employees would still, in the end, turn to them, despite the fact they said, "Look, you're empowered. You make the decisions." And so they had to say, "Fine, we're just going away. We'll work from home, and that leave you guys in charge." And that was really the stage at which the message got through to the employees that actually they were in charge, that they had complete autonomy. They were measured clearly on their own P&L, but they had to find their own business. They had to get their own suppliers. They had to run their own process. They had to design their own product, and so on. And essentially, each individual is an entrepreneur, a manager of their own little business, and so on. Now, to delegate to that extent, I think takes very brave, you might even say foolish, leaders running the company, because they are totally at the risk of the employees making potentially silly decisions. But so it's very much a model of trusting that the employees are going to do the right thing. They do have quite strict measurements. So every month they can see how well the sales are doing, how much the products are doing, how much profit each individual cell within the organization is making, so that the whole company won't go astray by very much without there being some measurement and correction in there. And you could also argue it's a self-correcting model, because the employees, if they don't make a profit one month, can't afford to pay themselves. It's as simple as that. So
But I've got a question before we
yeah,
jump to what the result was, which was indeed miraculous and inspirational. At the beginning of the book, they were trying to do things the old-fashioned way. They
mm,
were trying to patch the existing process. They were trying to apply Agile. They were bringing in consultants. And so my question is, what do you know of their personal journey from command and control and traditional business to ultimate autonomy of the individual? Because there was a personal journey, I'm guessing, above and beyond just the employee journey.
absolutely, yes. And that was one of kind of frustration with consultants, people coming in and advising them, and essentially people saying, "Look, here's a model, call it Agile, and here's what you have to do in order to be successful." So they tried adopting the model. They spent money on training the employees, introducing the systems. But the learning they came to was that you cannot just pick up a system from outside an organization, put it into the organization, and expect people to react positively. Because it's like they call it the corporate immune system rejects things that come in from outside, and unless it accepts that it's something that they kind of own themselves. And so you get a very small improvement when you introduce some agile process for a small while. But unless you've got the cooperation and collaboration of the employees, they will find a way of getting around it and stopping it, because it's not something that is endemic to them. It's something that's been imposed on them, and they don't want to have things imposed. So the kind of learning there was, you cannot just introduce uh, uh, agile, lean manufacturing systems and expect everybody just to say, yes, that'll work. So the
Mm-hmm.
learning was, what you do is you create an environment where the individuals take responsibility and they introduce their own process for making things successful. And boy, suddenly you get, as with the title of the book, 500% increase in productivity per employee, because they have every motivation now to make things work effectively, because A, they own the profit in that piece of the company, and B, it's not just financial, it's a kind of a pride in their work. Each individual owns their own little entrepreneurial business, and
Yeah.
and that's the way it works. So to kind of answer your question, it really took the the two guys running the company to recognize that don't impose things on people, uh, share the ownership of the company, and that's not just financial ownership, but emotional ownership of the results of the organization. So everybody's committed to it, and boy, will they find clever ways of doing things because they're motivated to do it. You don't have to tell them to do things in a lean way; they're going to do it as effectively as possible.
Yeah, it's impressive to see because I've seen the whole agile thing in so many different places, and I think so. There's two things you said. One is about just bringing in tools. The tools often themselves actually really don't change anything because they're often what's called garbage in, garbage out system. They don't change your mindset. You
Mm.
know, they're just you can do the old mistakes in new ways, essentially, because they let you do it. Because it really substantially doesn't change the people and how they think about things, and why
Yeah.
they do certain things in a certain way. It just imposes things. And the second thing you say is exactly that. Um, it's often that organizations don't really seem to ask the employees about if they want this or not, or how it would help them, or if it helps them. It just gets imposed on them, and obviously then the rejection is immense and often doesn't matter. And I keep tumbling about the number around about McKinsey saying at least 70%, if not more, of all these transformation efforts are are failing. They don't create the business benefits, as you said. They're incremental, if at all. And if you look at 70% of these efforts failing, apart from the money lost, it seems to be an industry that's utterly in peril, that needs to change because they're doing something terribly, terribly wrong. Otherwise, they wouldn't have such a bad hit rate. But I wanted to ask one question to follow that, because you mentioned a term I quite like and that has been mentioned around a lot of in all of the tech companies, which is value per employee, which was quite a focus for
Mm.
them to drive the change. Um, in that sense, can you explain a little bit value per employee and how that's been driving the change there, please?
Yes, because I think what they've done is said each employee is essentially an entrepreneur. Each one is running their piece of the company.
Hmm.
So the value that an employee brings is their own profit, essentially, because that's what they contribute to the company as a whole. But what the difference, I suppose, is that no longer are you talking about an employee being somebody who you pay per hour, who gets a salary. You're now talking about an entrepreneur. And interestingly, they lost most of the original employees. Only one employee kind of lasted all the way through, because most people, when they go to work, want to kind of have a secure salary and so on. And this is a fairly insecure environment they've set up, because if you don't succeed in running your business effectively, then you literally can't afford to pay yourself because you haven't got enough profit. Uh, so it takes a certain kind of person to make this happen. Um, Now, they therefore are motivated to create value because they see themselves running a mini business. And as I say, the nearest model I can think of is a franchise where each individual runs their own company, but they're under an umbrella. They have a common brand. They share with other colleagues and collaborate when they need to. But they're measured ultimately on obviously the profit they make financially, but their customer satisfaction and so on. The sort of measures that you would expect from a small business. And then when it came therefore to recruiting people into this scenario, they ended up looking at people who had already had a career in a conventional organization found it very difficult, because what you have in a conventional organization is people specialize. Whereas the whole problem here is that if you're running your own whole business, one individual there is one day dealing, doing selling to customers, the next day negotiating with suppliers, the next day designing a product, the next day filling in their accounts, doing their administration, everything a small business person does. And for people who worked in corporate environments, that's just alien, because they've specialized in something and they rely on the legal department to worry about something, or the HR department or something. None of that exists. They managed, and it's, as you see the story during the book, to get rid of all those overheads simply by creating an internal market and saying, fine, what's the value of the accounts department? The accounts department say, fine, we'll charge you £10 per invoice, because that's what it costs us to cut an invoice. And the employee says, well, I could write an invoice out for less than that myself. Now, if I need professional accountancy advice on some, because I'm not an accountant, I'll go buy that when I need it. But I'm not going to pay for the overhead of having an accounts department all the time when I don't need it. So it's just in time internal services, as and when you need it, is a much more cost effective model. So that's the way it works. And the power is in the hands of the generalist employee to choose when they need specialist advice, as opposed to having a tax on the employee because you already have overhead departments you've kind of got to pay for some way. So that's the kind of change in model, and that says the value that because the employee owns that, that's kind of the value per employee, if you want to look at it that way, and therefore you can very easily look at, it's a smaller number of employees and a larger turnover for the whole company, because you haven't got all these unproductive employees who are overheads, and you buy in the overhead service when you need. That's the kind of model.
Okay. So my biggest question out of reading the book is, at what point does that break when you start scaling? Because Matt Black was talking about 4 cells, and 4 cells that were all roughly in the same geographic space, in the same factory. And yes, I understand a franchise model can scale internationally and globally, and everyone adheres to the same kind of general principles in a franchise model. But in that particular model and having a marketplace, what happens when I've got a factory in Warwickshire and I've got a factory in Beijing and I've got a factory in Wyoming? How does that go small to go big scale? Where does it start to break?
Yeah, I think it starts to break probably where you have multiple locations. I think you picked on a good example. So you have to go to more of a higher type team model, maybe where you'll have groups of people running a small business as opposed to individuals running a small business. But as long as you've got it under one roof, they could go 20, 30, 50 employees quite happily. You get a point at which they still don't need the central overhead departments to support them, but they do need a level of collaboration between the individuals that starts to eat up more and more of their time. As long as the individuals can get on and do their little bit of the business and occasionally collaborate with their colleagues when they need to, that's fine. The minute you get to a stage where their interfaces start to become too great, then it starts to be overhead. You maybe need a bit more structure. But I would say in a single location manufacturing, remembering this is a manufacturing organization, you could run this model up to 100, 150 employees and still not have any layers of management on the top. Partly because one of the things that Andrew and Julian have done is put in place, they've written a whole software package that kind of reports back to them on how things are going in quite an efficient way. And so they do have, it may feel like it's a loose control model because they've let people get on with running their own mini business. But actually, they do have some relatively tight controls. So if somebody goes off their plan, it flags up to them quite quickly.
It's the old trust but verify.
Absolutely, yes. So they have the one kind of management person they employ is an auditor, so somebody who checks up on the figures on their behalf. So they do have somebody keeping a close eye on the performance of the organization, and that's financial performance, but it's also quality control as well, in terms of the customer satisfaction, the number of returns of product there are, and so on. And all of those measures, again, in the book, is um, not just productivity, but quality, reliability, product delivery times, and so on. All those things that measure the success in a manufacturing environment. They've got measures in place to make sure that it happens.
Yeah, there's one line in the book. I think I really hope I wrote this down right because it's a great line. It's like where it says, "Don't measure time." I think it says it at the beginning. I don't know. Where time is just a factor that is not as important as it seems to matter to a lot of organizations. Yet, in this case, it doesn't. And speaking as a consultant as well, we often get paid by time, especially if you're freelancing. There's a lot of that element there, and you're given X amount of time and needs to be done X amount of time, and it never seems to
Yeah,
really add up because also new ways of working like Agile also don't necessarily say, oh, it's done by them. We just iterate till it's good enough, right? Because that's what you want to go. And you mentioned
yeah,
quality assessment. So if you say don't measure time, why?
yeah.
What's the angle there over in the organization?
Well, the angle there is very simple. If you pay me by time, the longer I take, the more you pay me. So where's the incentive to do anything quickly? You know. Whereas in this case, if they do something slowly, it takes more time, and they're losing money because they're not working and producing something. So it's very much it is. We talk a lot about managing by output, rewarding people for results. This is absolutely what you do because uh, you know, the time is irrelevant. How long it takes them to do something is a cost to them if they can't be doing something else at the same time. It's not it doesn't relate to their income. So there's every incentive to work more effectively, get more output in the same time. If you pay them by the time, there's absolutely no incentive to do that. Obviously, if they can't produce anything at all, that's different. But the good example in the book is when conventionally, when they first started, we're trying things, they were paying overtime to people for working late, and so people were having to work. They could never get the job finished, so they simply said, "Tell you what we'll do: we'll buy out the overtime by simply paying everybody a salary, which fixed rate, but which included their average overtime for the employees for the previous 6 months. But we now don't insist they work the hours. Within 6 months, every employee except one was now working regular hours, didn't need to work the overtime, because actually they proved that they could, and they increased productivity immediately by something like 20%, just by doing that, because people were really slowing down in order to get paid more. So that's what conventional work does. The one person who was still working long hours turns out had domestic problems and wanted to stay at work and not go home. Uh, that was their motivation. Uh, uh, so just prove the point that paying for time just decreases productivity.
So I think from Marcus's perspective and my perspective, I really wish more procurement people would begin to think like this. But if you want to buy a day of my life, you can buy a day of my life, and it's easy for a procurement person to measure a day of my life and put a price on a day of my life. Instead, what I want to do is I'm going to deliver value to the business in a new business model, in a new value proposition, in a new go to market strategy. And that's much more subjective as to whether or not you actually delivered on that or didn't deliver on that. And it makes it more woolly. And people like concrete things that it's less subjective, it's more concrete. But I completely agree that I think when you give people the latitude and the flexibility, Marcus and I might complete something in a day's time, because we've got 20 odd years each of experience that a junior person might take 5 days to do. So where is the value in all of that? But anyway, it's a small kind of off on
Well,
a runner.
I don't know. I think there's a fundamental point here, because the traditional view of work is, I buy you in order to get something. So I pay you, I bribe you with money per hour in order for you not to be doing something you'd really prefer to be doing, like get playing golf or going fishing or whatever. But I have to buy that by the hour, because the unit of your life that I'm buying is time. And that's employment. You get a job, you kind of achieve your objectives in the job, but I own you as your employer for 38 hours a week or whatever it is. I'll let you have a little vacation if you behave yourself, but otherwise I own you, right? And that's time, uh, as opposed to it being a business relationship, which is I I only employ you because I want you to do something for me. So I want you to produce results. Guess what? If you're smart enough to do it in 3 days a week, good for you. Go play golf for the other 2 days. I've got what I want, right? But if in a corporate environment, if you clear off to play golf for 2 days, you'd soon get fired because you're not doing the job. So, but doing the job means filling the time available with useless corporate stuff that is not very productive.
Mm.
Hence the fundamental difference between buying you by the hour because you really prefer to be doing something else, and I'm bribing you, versus me creating a work environment which you actually want to come to because it's satisfying. You achieve something. You're motivated to do it. It's an environment where you're kind of really happy, and you want to do it. And that's kind of the independent entrepreneur versus the employee. And what Matt Black Systems has done is created a corporate environment, if you like, that has entrepreneurs in it who want to achieve something, who enjoy doing the job, as opposed to people who much prefer to be somewhere else but are being paid by the hour to come in and look busy. Yeah,
Mm.
it's like cynical
Right.
view, but this is the difference.
Yeah, and it's talking about not a cynical view but a sad view is we always have more questions than we have time. So, and this is the case yet again here, and here we are again. So I'll ask the last question for today. Even so, we have so many. Um, there's what I really like about the book is that there's so much evidence and really step by step seeing how a self-organized company actually came to pass, including failures, little failures here and there, and adjustments and whatnot. So it's a very, very authentic, open view on this, which makes it a really great book that doesn't just talk about the theory of teal organizations or self-managed organizations. So therefore, I want to ask you, because you've seen this so up close, do you think then therefore teal organizations are, or self-managed organizations are the future and every company should be like that, or is there a limit to it, or is it not for everyone, or sort of what's your view at this point on that?
Okay. I think very clearly what motivated me to write the book was this is a bit of an outlier as a company. They are an extreme of non-management. Two directors running a company who walk out of the building and just leave it up to the employees with a bit of control, but nevertheless leaving it to people. So it only works because the individuals that they have there are themselves entrepreneurial and self-motivated. So one of the debates I've had with Andrew and Julian is how scalable is this, and also how practical is it? Because if we've got a workforce generally who have been used to or indoctrinated by a conventional view of work, it's actually quite difficult for them to adjust to this one. They've got to take a lot of personal responsibility. They've got to take risk. Okay, now the reward is there, but a lot of individuals want a safe job where as long as they perform adequately, it's fine. This is you're running a mini business. It is more risky. So one of the practical issues is finding the right people who who will perform in this environment. And one of the things they have to do is look at recruit people who are sort of young graduates almost, who have not been polluted by the conventional way of working, in order to make it happen. So to that extent, it's difficult to see it expanding to a vast proportion of business. But because it is that much more productive, they're in the aerospace industry, they can be more competitive than other people, and therefore they will win business and they'll survive in what now, particularly in the kind of post-COVID era, is a difficult environment. The aerospace, I think they will survive, where other small companies working conventionally may go bust, because the proof of this is in the increased productivity. Hence the title of the book, 500%. That's how much per employee they've increased the revenue, which is pretty dramatic compared with any other increase in productivity.
And speaking of post-COVID, a little bird tells me that maybe you've got a new book coming out. What would you like to have a quick mention of the new book before we wrap up?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Never Going Back: How COVID Changed Work for Better. It's just, it's taken the last 4 months of been writing it with a fellow author, Mark Thomas, and we've just observed the massive changes that have happened in people's approach to work, with enforced home working being the kind of catalyst with COVID. And now we're a really interesting time where people are talking about work becoming much more hybrid. So people will want to work more remotely. They will want to go back in the office for meetings, but not to sit at desks and do conventional knowledge work. And so we've got a whole new era. The challenge there, of course, is now how do you lead and manage organizations which are now hybrid? You don't have everybody around you all the time. You've got a much more distributed organization. You can now employ people the other side of the world to work for you, because we're much more used to having meetings on Zoom. And all those things that have suddenly happened over the last year have accelerated a change towards much more virtual working. And that's what the book looks at.
Well, Peter, with any luck at all, we'll have you and your co-author both show up on a future version or future edition of the Wicked podcast. Marcus, I want to thank you very much for your time today, and we wish you a great weekend.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to the Wicked podcast with co-host Marcus Kirsch and me, Troy Norcross.
Please subscribe on Podomatic, iTunes, or Spotify. You can find all relevant links in the show notes. Please tell us your thoughts in the comment section and let us know about any books for future episodes.
You can also get in touch with us directly on Twitter on @WickedandBeyond or @Troy_Norcross. Also, learn more about the Wicked Company book and the Wicked Company project at wickedcompany.com.